Welcome to the Latter-day Freemen Podcast, a podcast dedicated to building a movement of Latter-day Saints united in defense of the principles of freedom and our inspired Constitution. I am your host, Jacob Hibbard, and I am joined as I am each week by my fellow Freemen, by Tyson Hardcastle and Jeremy Anderson. It's so good to be with you guys tonight. It's been an exciting week for me personally, a lot of good things happening. And this Sunday is Independence Day, which is, I think, probably my favorite holiday, at least one of my favorite holidays. If the weather was better, it would definitely be my favorite holiday. But it's an exciting time, and I'm really excited to have a discussion with you. And so what we thought that we would talk about this week in recognition and in celebration of Independence Day is the Declaration of Independence, that great document that was signed July 4th, 1776. And the Declaration of Independence, while I think generally seen by most Americans as a good thing, there has also been throughout time and through American history times where people have questioned the validity or the relevance of the Declaration of Independence to our times. And to kind of create that framework to get us going discussing about this, I wanted to share a quote from President Woodrow Wilson in a talk that he gave on May 12th, 1911 to the Jefferson Club of Los Angeles. And so this is what President Wilson said. He said, "I am constantly reminding audiences that I have the pleasure of addressing that the rhetorical introduction of the Declaration of Independence is the least part of it. That was the theoretical expression of the views of which the rest of the document was meant to give teeth and substance to. The Declaration of Independence is a long enumeration of the issues of the year 1776, of exactly the things that were then supposed to be radical matters of discontent among the people living in America, the things which they meant to remedy in the spirit of the introductory paragraphs, but which the introductory paragraphs themselves did not contain. Now, the business of every true Jeffersonian is to translate the terms of those abstract portions of the Declaration of Independence into the language and problems of his own day. If you want to understand the real Declaration of Independence, do not read the preface." So that's President Wilson kind of questioning, in a way, the relevance or importance of the preface of the Declaration of Independence, which is where, as he says, more of the theoretical expression or the principles portion of the Declaration. And so I want to open this up to both of you. Is Wilson and some of the other people who have had similar ideas right? Is the Declaration of Independence still relevant to us today?
Yeah, so I find it interesting when I read the Declaration of Independence. I feel like my mind is immediately drawn to the preface, and I read the preface and I reread the preface and I contemplate the preface, and then I go on and I read the grievances, and the grievances give me an idea of what the people of the time were going through. But for me, the meat and the substance and what remains relevant today is the preface. And so when you ask the question, was President Wilson right? I would personally have to come in and say, I don't believe so, because to me, the timeless aspect of the Declaration of Independence is the preface. And then the grievances are just kind of context, give us an idea of what led the framers of the Declaration of Independence to the conclusions contained in the preface.
Right. I really agree with that. The principles that the founders were acting on, they're contained in the preface of the Constitution, of the Declaration, and they're really powerful principles. And so I'd say absolutely the Declaration of Independence is relevant in our day, because it gives us those principles that we can base our actions on today.
I really like this quote from President Benson, and he talks about the Declaration of Independence. He says, "The Declaration of Independence, to which these great men affix their signatures, is much more than a political document. It constitutes a spiritual manifesto, revelation, if you will, declaring not for this nation only, but for all nations, the source of man's rights. And to me, that was really powerful language. But I think it's absolutely spot on. In the Declaration of Independence, we see one of the most pure articulations of true principles that, like President Benson said, are applicable not just for their time, but for our time. But like, I also think it's powerful for him to say, not just for our country, but for all nations. And it reminds me a lot of Section 98, where it talks about how the principles of the Constitution are for all mankind. And it's the same principles that we see in the Constitution is reflected in the Declaration. The Declaration is the mission statement of America. The Constitution is the execution to the best of their ability, or our ability, to try to execute that vision.
And one of the questions that comes to my mind as we're talking about this is, what are what's our equivalent of the list of grievances today? What are the things that we need to be applying the principles of the Constitution to? And I don't think I have an answer for that question, but I think it's something that we should really ponder on as we're reading this document. And hopefully everyone is reading it this week as we're coming up on the 4th of July. I know it's a time for like partying, and it's a time for celebration and hot dogs, hamburgers, get out the grill. But it's really a time for studying this too, and pondering, what do I need to apply these principles to today? And how can I uphold these principles in my sphere now? So you brought up from President Benson's quote, the fact that the Declaration of Independence, it singles out God as the source of our rights. It says the rights come from the Creator, and all men were created equally by God. And it's a really prominent declaration. It's kind of a I don't know if it was that at the time, but today it stands as this I don't have the right words for this, but it stands out that they are publicly declaring God as the creator of all men and the source of our rights. And that's really important. And then next, I felt like they come out and they start to enumerate what those rights are. And that's really important for us as well.
President Benson also kind of really hits on in his talk the proper role of government. He also talks about this in the Constitution Heavenly Banner, about the importance of our rights coming from God. He said, rights are either God-given as part of the divine plan, or they are granted by government as part of the political plan. Reason, necessity, tradition, and religious convictions all lead me to accept the divine origin of these rights. If we accept the premise that human rights are granted by government, then we must be willing to accept the corollary that they can be denied by government. I, for one, shall never accept that premise. As the French political economist Frederic Bastiat phrased it so succinctly, life, liberty, and property do not exist because men have made laws. On the contrary, it is the fact that life, liberty, and property existed beforehand that caused men to make laws in the first place. And that's President Benson quoting from the law by Frederic Bastiat. But I think that, like you said, Jeremy, declaring at the beginning, well, it's not true, like in that wonderful second paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, the divine origin of rights, really, as President Benson says, sets the table and the stage for interpreting everything when it comes to politics. And if you come to a different conclusion, like he said, there's so many other implications and things that you by extension are picking up along with it, and some of those things are things I don't think we want to pick up, so to speak, or to grant.
As I was preparing for this podcast, I took a moment to look up the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This Universal Declaration, it was put forth by the United Nations in 1948 as a common standard of achievements for all peoples and all nations. And one of the things that was really interesting is the striking contrast that there's no mention of God in any of this. They put forth the kind of the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace as being supported by if we uphold these rights. They say it's essential to promote development of friendly relations between nations, and these rights will help that. And they go forward and they have this enormous document outlining a lot of really good things that also are paralleled in the Declaration of Independence. But then they're also adding other things in. And I think it speaks to that lack of grounding, that the founders, they were really grounded in the covenant with God. They were grounded in their understanding of God and of humanity. And you don't see that in this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you start to see some things that they're declaring that get really troublesome towards the end, where they say everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for health and well-being of himself and his family. They don't say that they have a right to the opportunity for that. They don't say anything about responsibility. People have a responsibility to take care of themselves. They say, no, people have this right. And nations need to come together and make sure everybody has this. And it lays the groundwork for a really different understanding of humanity than what the founders have.
I wanted to read a little bit from the Declaration, and you could almost like have like a ping like sound every time there's like a little nugget of divine truth in there. But just like this line here, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. I mean, even those just few sentences, like I said, if we had a principal censor or that would go ping, it would be going ping, 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 ping. I mean, there's even that first part where it says we hold these truths to be self-evident. The concept of self-evident truth is something that I think is really challenged and not really believed by a lot of people today. I mean, we're having debates over whether objective truth itself that's objective can be discovered at all, and even some people question whether it exists at all. And here the founders are saying, no, like there is objective truth, and that it's self-evident or that it's discoverable. And they don't say it right here, but when you read their writings, that we can discover truth, that it's discoverable, it's noble, and it's self-evident through reason and revelation, that we can get, God is a source of divine truth. That's why, when we talked about morality and the importance of morality, that God is a source of truth, but that also through our reason that we can discover those principles and truths as well. And we have these two witnesses to truth. And like I said, like just that assertion is an assertion that would be, I think, is challenged today.
So from that reading, I would like to say maybe 4 truths there, right? Like all men are created equal. They're endowed with unalienable rights or natural rights or rights that are discoverable in nature. To secure these rights, governments are instituted, and then governments derive their power from the consent of those who are governed. And I feel like this kind of takes us back to the beginning quote of why I feel it's so problematic to say you ignore the preface and go to the grievances, because the grievances are just practical or they're anecdotal evidence of ways that the British monarchy violated these 4 truths that we find in the preface. And so if we go back, if we contemplate in our day, what are the examples or the grievances that we have today, it would be what is today violating these truths as they stand, because those are unalterable, those are unchangeable, and they exist throughout time and eternity.
Yeah, I really hit on a lot of those as well. I mean, the concept of all men being created equal. is super important. President McKay said that whether born in abject poverty or shackled at birth by inherited riches, everyone has the most precious of all life's endowments, the gift of free agency. And that concept that we're all equal in God's eyes, but all equal in our rights. Milton Friedman did in his essay on Created Equal, talks a lot about that, how our natural equality of man isn't rooted in talents or abilities or material possessions that we're born into, or intelligence or any of those things. It's all rooted in liberty, and that the being equal in the sight of God and being equal in our rights promotes and is compatible with liberty, as opposed to other types of equality that sometimes get pushed. And I think that that's also just very relevant to our own times and the different ideas that we're dealing with and the different kinds of policies and questions that we have. I mean, also just like listing life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and even the phrase saying among these. So there's more rights than just life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But the idea that it's a right to pursue and not right to, like you were talking about, Jeremy, and the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's just these powerful truths, just almost like casually, just all put together.
Another thing that I pulled out from this: when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. They talk about this right and duty. It's not a right to like a condition of ease, or a right to a certain lifestyle, but it's this duty that they have to God almost, because they are seeing the things that he gave them be threatened and taken away from them, and they see it not just in a single instance of one abuse or one usurpation, but they see this design that their former government has of reducing them under tyranny. And so they say it's our duty to throw off tyranny, because God gave us these unalienable rights, and we have to protect them. And so I love that with the rights goes this duty to protect them. And it's just this worldview where men are agents, where we and women are agents. We act, and we're responsible for ourselves. We're responsible for our own rights. And it's not something where government needs to give this to me or anybody else. It's something that I need to protect and I need to take care of.
And the neat thing is that same principle is echoed in the scriptures a lot. I mean, Captain Moroni in his letter to Pahoran and kind of the issues that he deals with the kingmen, but even in the Doctrine and Covenants in section 134, verse 5, it says, "We believe that all men are bound to sustain and uphold the respective governments in which they reside, while protected in their inherent and inalienable rights by the laws of such government." And so one thing that I just think is super neat about the Declaration and these principles is that we can find second witnesses.
And I love the founders themselves. They were very careful in this declaration. They have this preface, the preamble, if you will, of the Declaration, to explain why they feel like it's okay for them to do what they're doing. And they weren't looking for power. They weren't looking to create their own nation, really. A lot of the founders were really tied back to their English heritage, and they wanted to keep this connection, but they saw this long train of abuses, and they saw the design of the king to put them in tyranny, and they said, this goes against eternal principles, And so we have to change things. We have to do something different.
Yeah, you definitely see the reluctance. This wasn't a casual choice. And like, I have some friends or people I see sometimes who talk about, oh, we need another 1776, or they talk about like revolt and throwing off and establishing new governments just way too casually. And that when you look, like you said, Jeremy, at the Declaration, after these wonderful principles are outlined, it's a list of all the things that are going wrong, and then a list of all the things that they've tried to do to fix it before it got to this point. And so while the right to throw out and the duty, as you rightfully pointed out, to resist tyranny is established, a silent principle, I think, that's articulated is that it's not something done casually, that this is a last resort thing, and that we have a duty to exhaust every other avenue of change before we ever consider, proverbially grabbing our muskets and going down to Lexington and Concord.
So I think it's important then in our day, especially as we approach the 4th of July, to contemplate these truths that we were given, and to maybe even recommit ourselves to making sure that those truths are paramount to our political activity and our personal strivings, in our personal life. And so what does that look like, do you guys think?
I think first thing is knowing it, actually reading it and knowing the principles that are there, and having that respect, that knowledge. I mean, can we identify these principles in practice? If not,
it's hard for us to see where we have maybe gone astray from principles if we don't know the principles themselves. And so, for instance, deriving power from the consent of those who are governed, right? Like, if you don't understand that concept or that principle, if you don't understand that it was, in the bedrock of our nation, then it's going to be hard for you to understand that when leaders pretend to have power outside of the consent of those who are governed, that is in violation with that bedrock on which our nation was founded. And that's a problem for us today. And we need to strive to get back to where we were before. And so understanding these principles, studying these principles, being well acquainted with them so that we can detect when we're being sold something that is contrary to those principles is very important as citizens in a country.
I mean, and it's even things as basic of whether we need a government at all. I mean, the Declaration establishes that to secure these rights, we establish governments. And there are people who look at the problems of our current society and then come to the conclusion, well, if we had no government, none of this would be a problem. And the Declaration, corrects that view, and the scriptures themselves correct that as well. Section 134, verses 1 and 2, in a lot of ways remind me a lot of the Declaration. And it says that we believe that governments were instituted of God for the benefit of man, and that he holds men accountable for their acts in relation to them, both in making laws and administering them. And then he says, we believe that no government can exist in peace. He says such laws are framed and held inviolate as will secure to each individual the free exercise of conscience, the right and control of property, and the protection of life. And so, again, there are these second witnesses that we have in our own scriptures and the words of our prophets that reinforce these principles. And if we don't have a handle on them, when we do make our list of grievances, which I think that would be a great podcast to kind of try to make our own list of Declaration grievances. But when we make those lists and we identify that, hey, something's not working here, we don't go down the wrong path to solve those issues and stray from those principles even further.
I think also it's important to understand the kind of the perspective, the paradigm of the founders. I think that's one of the things that if we can understand how they saw the world, that will help us and we can adopt some of that perspective. That will help us in our own day. They had a lot of the right perspective on the world, especially in writing these documents. And so what did they really mean when they said equal? how are men equal, and what did they mean by that, and what did they mean when they said rights? Those are both really hot topics, I think, in our world today, where people are redefining equality and people are redefining rights, and we need to understand what the founding fathers meant when they included those words, and what their view of humanity was.
And that's kind of what our podcast that we try to do here is to dive into those kinds of issues and provide the words from the founders, words from the prophets, so that we can have a correct understanding of those important concepts, because they're inspiring ideas. I mean, the words of the Declaration have inspired countless individuals, even people who, like Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King Jr., who were living in a country that wasn't living up to these principles. They still recognized the power of these concepts and were able to use that to call on us as a nation to be better than what we were being, to live up to the promise. I mean, I love Frederick Douglass called the Declaration of Independence a promissory note. And I love that idea that this is our credo. This is the national creed. I think it was Margaret Thatcher who said that America is the only country that was ever founded on a creed. And this is the creed of our country. And if we don't have an understanding of it, we will not understand our country.
And we need to remember, I think, that the purpose of our country was to usher in the restoration of the gospel, that to create an environment where that restoration could thrive, to usher in the fullness of truth that we enjoy in this dispensation today. And so if we begin to lose that, then we also put at risk the great blessings that we enjoy as members of the Church of Latter-day Saints and the great blessings that come from the gospel. What we see today is a great contest or struggle between governments that force populations to do certain things and to be certain things, and a government that opens it up for people to become certain things based off of their personal feelings of right and wrong, and spirit-led action, if that makes sense. So it's got quite the consequence, I guess, if we just let that go to waste. So
no, I totally agree. And I need to correct myself. I misspoke. It was not Margaret Thatcher. It was G.K. Chesterton who said that America is the only nation in the world that was ever founded on a creed. Well, I think this has been a really good discussion. And the main takeaway for me has been that the Declaration of Independence is important and relevant to our times as it's ever been, in terms of that the principles are as relevant as they have ever been. And that as we celebrate our independence this weekend, I think that we would all do well to read the Declaration, reflect on those principles and what they mean, and look for ways that we can better advocate and apply them to the world that we live in. Because I think our country right now, more than ever, needs a return to these principles. Jeremy, Tyson, any final thoughts?
I think you said it well.
To sum it up, it's like the Declaration of Independence carries some significant eternal principles, and it's something that we should be well acquainted with so that we can defend those in our day-to-day lives.
Awesome. But we'd like to thank you all for joining us on this fantastic discussion. I feel like in a lot of ways, this podcast and what we've been talking about today just gives us a list of topics that we can dive deeper in future episodes. And so I'm really looking forward to those discussions and conversations, and really appreciate both you, Jeremy, and Tyson, your thoughts on this important document. As we've said before, we are on lots of different platforms, and we encourage you to like, subscribe, and to share our podcast with those around you. You can listen to us on Spotify, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Podcast Addict, Google Podcasts, Anchor, Breaker, Pocket Casts, Radio Public, and of course, YouTube. We'd love to hear from you. So, leave a comment, subscribe, share, give us a 5-star review if you can. Hopefully we've earned it in your eyes. We're trying our best. And like I said, if you have a topic, I've said in the past, if you have a topic that you'd like us to cover that you find interesting, or would like our perspective on, you can contact the show on Facebook, on our Facebook page, Latter-day Freemen, on Instagram and on Twitter, or you can email us directly at latterdaystreemen76@gmail.com. Well, for Tyson and Jeremy, thank you so much again for being with us. Have a wonderful Independence Day weekend, and we will see you next week.